Hello and welcome to Retropower Uncut episode 83. Take 15. So I'm going to start with Project Utah and these mirror mountings here, which you probably remember we designed from scratch, did some 3D print prototypes, and then Alitech have been machining those in brass, and they turned up I think either Thursday or Friday last week. We did a trial fit, happy with how they sat. So we sent them off to Derby Plating, and I have to give a shout out to Derby Plating on this occasion. It's rare we find companies that continuously exceed our expectations. And I said, oh, we're in a bit of a hurry for these, could you turn them around? You know, thinking maybe 1 to 2 weeks, it's normally a good few weeks. And he rang me on Monday to say they were ready, which is a complete disbelief to me. And the quality is absolutely astonishing. So, yeah, we picked them up on Monday, got them on, and that's one of the remaining things we were waiting for in terms of components to get those mirrors on, which they've kind of been a long time coming because we kept chopping and changing our mind over what was going to look right. We took quite a lot of changes to revise the design, and we wanted to get the seats in to make sure they sat at a nice angle and weren't obscured. It's quite difficult to get the position right because this one you actually view behind this pillar, and the other one you view through the quarter light. And depending on how big or small you are, that changes the angle as well. So for me, you can see a bit of this latch in the passenger one, but I know Ian, who we're doing the car for, is a bit smaller than me, so he's going to be sitting further forward, so I suspect it'll be fine. So yeah, really happy with those. They're on. And the other thing was the start switch, which we went a bit around the houses on the design of that as well. We've got the main switch panel has got these things called chicken head switches on there, and we did like a big version of that for the start switch, and we 3D printed it, and I was happy with it. And then I just happened to be working. I was taking the clutch master cylinder out when that had a problem the other week. And I looked over while I was in the footwell, and we had the prototype one on there, and I thought, actually, it's blocking the text that says engine crank underneath, which was a nice detail on there. So we went back to the drawing board, and we looked at some 1950s Rolls-Royce dashes, and there was this really cool, I mean, it was chrome in the Rolls-Royce, but this cool sort of crank handle design that was like a little round dome with a flat blade that sort of curved out slightly. So we drew up a version of that. And then 3D printed a trial, really happy with that. Customer said okay, so Andy at Concept 303 machined that from acetal, and that looks great in there now. So I think that's just the finishing touch on there, brought everything together there. The mirror's on. I've finished all my spanner checking work on this now, just got to put the rear spats back on. And I'm essentially now waiting for good weather. We were just saying before we put the camera on that outside at the moment it sounds like all hell's breaking loose. There's rain lashing down, wind rattling the shutters. So I'm definitely not going out in it today, that's for sure. But yeah, next week, fingers crossed for the weather. I'm just going to get some miles on this, and then we're very close to handover. Land Cruiser, I'm going to mention mechanically, it's not here at the moment. In fact, most of the components aren't here because we've been going through the various processes of getting everything ready. So I think last time we mentioned that we were getting the chassis ready to be blasted and powder coated. There are a few little things to do still on that. So Tom was going to do a modification on where the rear cross member is and the rear lights mount. There's like a little tab on the end with a threaded insert in it as standard, and we were getting rid of that and putting a little smooth end on which matched the profile of the machined lamp protectors we'd made. So he was doing that change, and there was another change as well, and I can't think what it was. There was a small hole we had to put in the front for where the spotlight bracket we'd made. It's like a tubular mount for the spotlights. We've drilled holes in there to run the wiring to the spotlight through the mount, and then we wanted to join that with a hole on the chassis so that the wiring is completely hidden to that. And then we were also masking all of the holes, all the threaded holes on the chassis, so they don't get powder coat build-up in them. There's different ways you can do that. On a lot of the stuff, we've been prepping loads of components for it this week as well. We've got these little silicon kind of conical bungs that you can put in to stop powder coat getting in. On the chassis, we've actually done bolts in all holes, just sacrificial bolts essentially. Now they're cap heads, and we just fill the cap, the socket, Allen key socket with silicon, so you can just ping that out afterwards and get an Allen key in there and undo them. But it's just a nice way of keeping the threads really clean in a way that's not going to fall out during blasting. So the chassis is ready, the axle casings are ready, I think we probably showed them being prepped last week, but with those again, we strip everything out the axle, get the empty casing, bolt it back together, and then anywhere there's an opening, so the pinion hole and the axle shaft holes, we get wood cappings that we make, sealant them on, attach them with a threaded bar right through the axle and then on the pinion as well. So everything's completely sealed up, and then any machined faces, so the mating faces are masked by virtue of the fact that we have the casing reassembled together. And then things like the flange where the pinion goes and the axle half shaft flanges, they're masked by these wooden caps. So any kind of machine surfaces are kept free of powder coat. So that's ready to go. And then there's been various other bits we've been prepping for powder coat, you know, masking up holes, etc. So a massive batch of parts has just gone for powder coat. I'm not actually sure how many, but I would say there was a good sort of 20, 30 parts. And then the fasteners for the Land Cruiser, so all the fasteners for the axles, anything that's attached to the chassis, body mounts, that sort of thing, leaf spring shackles, they've all been prepared for Xylan coating, and also all the moving parts or components of the axle that have things bolted to, so the knuckles that have the calipers bolted to them, that sort of thing. They've all been prepared for Xylan coating. And the leaf springs themselves, we wanted to use original leaf springs with a view to them being probably better quality than aftermarket ones. So we've actually stripped them apart to the individual leaves. They're going to be Xylan coated, and that's quite good because it's a Teflon coating essentially. It means there's a bit of slip between the leaves, and then they'll be re-riveted back together afterwards. So there's been a Xylan plating batch, which was I think 700 odd parts, and that kind of brings me on to something that actually the customer mentioned, because I showed him a photo of all the engine fasteners coming back from zinc plate, and they're all just in a big tub. And he said, how on earth do you know where they all go after you've had that done? Which is actually a really good question. And it's worth pointing out our process there. So on the engine fasteners, for instance, when Adam stripped the engine down, he's literally got a list in a notepad of every fastener, where it was, the size of the fastener. That's all in a massive list. And then what we do is we put those fasteners, as we take them off, next to a bag which we've labelled as what part of the engine it came from, let's say inlet, manifold, bolts, whatever. Photograph them next to that bag, so you've got a photograph with the bolts and a label of what they did. Then the bolts all get put into one big tub which goes away for plating or coating or whatever. But we've obviously given them then a stack of bags that are labelled and the photos. So when they come back from plating, we take everything out of the big tub of stuff that's been plated, and then we can use the photographs as reference to match them back up with their bags, put them in the bags, and then we've got a stack of labelled bags with all the components, where they went on the engine, and as a fail-safe, a list as well in case the plating company lose everything. So that's how we do that. Going to move over here. This will be a surprise. Vader is back here, and much to my frustration, and no doubt the owners, we had a failure on it. So the clutch slave cylinder, which is a concentric slave inside the bell housing, failed very, very soon in him having the car back. He'd done a couple of journeys, but not many miles. So rather frustrating. Yeah, clutch pedal went to the floor, fluid out everywhere, and sure enough, we took it apart, and the seals have failed in the clutch slave cylinder. So you probably watched previous episodes where I've been ranting on about poor quality aftermarket parts, and this just tallies up with that again. So we've got this out to replace the one that was in there with an AP one. So I've got an AP clutch slave coming. We're just machining up a different adapter because the bolt pattern's slightly different. I'm not totally surprised it happened, because the other Chevette we built had the same failure, but it lasted a lot longer before that failure occurred, and actually we'd put this one together before the other one failed, and it had done a good few seasons of rallying. So I kind of put it down to the trauma of doing a few seasons rallying, but it's not. It's evidently an issue with the seal inside the cylinder. So both cars will then be running AP cylinders once we've done the conversion on this. So everything out, it's easiest on this to get the engine off the gearbox off the engine. You can't just pull it back because of the way the shifter sits through the hole in the tunnel. So it's almost impossible to get the gearbox off the engine in situ. So it's actually easier just to drop the entire front subframe down with the engine and box on it, then separate it all. And it's actually gave us the opportunity to tackle a couple of other little things, as a result of sort of snagging and shakedown. There was a very small oil leak which only seemed to occur when the car was switched off, which is likely the dry sump tank draining back into the sump and basically filling the engine up to the point where there's oil sitting against the crank seal on the back, and I suspect it would be that. Now, as it is, I've just sent the engine back to the engine builder so he can have a look and just determine where the leak was and reseal it all. But it was a convenient to get that done whilst we had that out. We're also going to swap in some of our softer World Cup engine mounts. We did our own for Gordon Murray's car a while ago that are 40 Shore rubber rather than the 70 or 80 Shore that the usually available ones are. And although it wasn't really an issue, this one running the harder ones, because it's a fairly raw motorsporty car anyway, while we had the engine out and we now have a batch of those in stock again, we thought we'll swap them in just to get the engine vibration levels down slightly. So yeah, basically clutch repairs, tackling a couple of other things while we're at it. And then that'll be going back to the owner again. John's been on with the Morris. In fact, he's on with it right now. So we're doing the Dynamat sound deadening on the inside of the Morris shell. Basically templating all the different areas where it's going to go, using paper, just cutting paper to the shape we want, transfer it onto the Dynamat, cut the piece out, stick it in, move on to the next piece. That's going really well, and it does really help keep that kind of drumming of the panels down, and on a car like this where we're trying to make it fairly refined, it's a really good step. And then on top of that Dynamat Extreme, we'll then have Dynaliner, this half-inch Dynaliner, which is more like a foamy material, which helps further deaden the sound, but it's also quite a good temperature barrier. So the car's going to have aircon, and it'll keep a lot of the exhaust heat out from the cabin and help keep it cool inside. And vice versa in winter. It's going to Scotland, so actually it's probably more commonly going to be beneficial the other way around, where it'll be keeping it warm inside. But that's going in. We do that at this stage because we're then going to do some wax oiling down inside the doors, etc., before we do the wet sanding and polishing of the paint. Just so if water does manage to find its way into the doors, it's not straight into a bare metal seam. And we do the Dynamat before that, because any wax oil vapour that kind of drifts out tends to then not make the Dynamat stick. So Dynamat going in, wax oil, and then we're going to be wet sanding and buffing that. Clippers on the ramp, because now this ramp's free, we're going to carry on with the fuel system. We're getting the in-tank lift pump in it, and then plumbing that up to a little swirl anti-surge tank that's got a Bosch 044 pump actually immersed inside it, which will be mounted up underneath, which will give us the combination of the two pumps will give us our anti-surge and high pressure feed that we want for the supercharged engine we're building for that. So that's that. Probably the main area of progress elsewhere in here worthy of mention is the E-Type. So George has done more scanning work on that. I think he was actually doing it in the background when I did last week's video. We'd previously done a scan of all the back end and the inside, but without the bonnet and doors on. So we had all the engine, etc., which we really wanted for when we start modelling engine components, but we'd never done one with the bonnet on. So we've now done a full scan with the bonnet on, the doors on, and we took the bonnet off and scanned the underside of the bonnet as well. And that's for a number of reasons. We got to the point where, with the rear end remodelling, that we wanted to assess that with the rest of the car in the render. So now we've got the full model with the bonnet, the whole car, that we can do a visual render of with the changes done, so we can assess that and tweak and change. But then we'll also need it for when we start work on the front bumper, headlights, grille, all of the front end components we've got to design, and the changes we're making to the front of the bonnet, which are very minimal actually. It's a great shape as standard, so it's just going to be deleting the Series 3 indicator side light plinths from the front, and then just doing a nice bumper and grille design. But having the underside of the bonnet scanned, it's going to be really handy when we come to design engine components, because we scanned it with the bonnet off and the engine in, and then the bonnet at both sides. You can literally look at the clearance between the engine and all the underside of the bonnet, which is particularly going to be useful when we come to do the air boxes. It's going to run Gemmy throttle bodies, but then we're going to do air boxes on there, which actually mate up to some air ducting structure that's on the inside of the standard bonnet. Now that normally feeds just the heater blower and the foot air vents. But what we're going to do is repurpose that, because it's the only air feed at the front that doesn't go through the radiator. As standard, there was some small air intakes kind of crammed in with a kind of half-arsed, if I'm honest, shroud above the radiator that got a little bit of air that came over the top of the radiator, but it's really not a great arrangement at all. Whereas actually the cabin air feed is really a separated feed each side of the main radiator that it sort of splits off at the very mouth of the car. So we're going to use that air ducting, reshape it sort of somewhere along the bonnet to then mate up with our own air boxes. So it'll get a cold air feed to the engine through there. So multiple reasons, but we're in full 3D scan render mode on that at the moment. Speaking of scan and render, George and I went over to scan an Allegro today. Now, Instagram followers probably won't be totally surprised by this. YouTube followers maybe, but we are building a pair of Austin Allegros starting, I think they're actually the next arrivals, not just yet, but in the coming months. We'll kind of keep the exact spec under wraps, but suffice to say, we wanted to scan the engine bay and the positions of things like the bonnet, wings, bulkhead, with a view to what mechanicals are going to go into them. So we'll reveal more of that when the time comes, but they're certainly going to be pretty special, and I'm hoping it'll be one of those projects where at the start everybody thinks, what on earth are you doing with an Allegro? You can't possibly make that a good car, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, we prove everybody wrong, and even my own scepticism, and turn out a belting couple of cars. So that's to come in a few months. In the meantime, I'll hand over to Nat to see what's been going on in the metalwork side.
Right, I'm in a mental block. Right, thank you, Cal, for the handover, and welcome to another week in the Retropower Metalwork shop. And by my right hand, we have Project 1, the MK1 Escort. As you can see, we've got a little bit more done. Tom and I have been working on this week, and we have this quarter panel joined together and attached to the car. We've had a few ups and downs along the way with the joining together. We've, just the lower sill joint portion of the quarter panels are short by about 3/4 of an inch. So they've both had to be lengthened where they meet the front half of the body side, but the quarter panel and front body side joined to make the complete body side. So we had to do a little bit of a lengthening there, and obviously fettling at the top and juggling around and fitting and unfitting and fitting and unfitting the body side several times, probably several tens of times, and putting the jig on and off and on and off and on and off. But we've got everything in the right place. Took it off, welded it up, blended all that out, put it all back on, chased out everything, checked all the dimensions, made sure all the window apertures were the right size, roughly threw a door in to check that was somewhere near the right size. Got everything lined up as best we can, made sure everything worked, got the window jigs in, had all the fixtures clamped up, got everything fitted up, loosely checked the door hinges were somewhere in the right ballpark, everything looked good, so that is now pretty much fully spot welded on. There's a couple of bits where we can't get at with the spot welder because of the fixture being on at the moment. There's a few little bits left to finish spot welding, but the vast bulk of that is now spot welded in place. And we've moved on to the far side where the body side front section is on, not spot welded on, it's clamped on. The quarter panel is now temporarily clamped on because Tom's just working out the join points and making sure they're set correctly, having lengthened the bottom section, as I say, and then that'll be tacked up, that'll come off, car gets welded up on the bench, and then go back on. Final check, trial fit of everything again. Once we're happy with everything there, probably adjust the window gaps and the flange widths and everything else. Then we'll get that on, fully clamped everywhere, lots and lots and lots of clamps to all the points on the fixture. All the apertures will have multiple clamps around them, clamps on the roof, clamps along the bottom, everything fully clamped up. Final dimensional check, diagonals put in between, as you may remember from across, there's two diagonals that go in across the corners of the roof to the lower parts of the pillars of the jig. Get everything in, all the aperture jigs clamped in, everything clamped, basically every set of clamps we've got anywhere all clamped to the car, and at that point then that side will be spot welded up as well. So end of play tomorrow, both the body sides should be done, and we'll be either doing the roof or the rear panel, depending on. I think we might actually do the rear panel. Might be a fresh week job starting on the roof because we've got to get the gutters on, and getting the gutter alignments quite fiddly. So we might do that as a fresh Monday task rather than a Friday task. But yeah, basically next week we should have all the mending the shell metalwork basically done, and we'll be moving into the phase of sort of finishing that off. Tom will be finishing that off while I do a bit more CAD work, and we'll be moving on into the custom metalwork rather than the standard Escort metalwork. There'll be some bits going on in parallel, like we've got to seam braze, we'll be seam brazing and a few bits of seam welding, mainly seam TIG brazing the body shell, so there's work to do there as well. A lot of that will be done on the rotisserie, but some of it will be done on here. And we've got the transmission tunnel, the larger transmission tunnel to put in, and various other jobs as well. So there'll be a few things going on in parallel, and probably Tom will be doing most of that while I get the fixtures made for the rear end. Which viewers who have seen the Gordon Murray Mark 1 Escort build will know about the independent rear end that was built for that. This is going to be very similar, not the same, but very similar to that. And I only made some very, very rudimentary, very temporary fixtures which we scrapped when that car was done because we weren't planning on building any more. And it was, pretty much a one-off build. So I need to make new fixtures for that, which is no bad thing because there are going to be a couple of changes made to the rear end anyway. It's one of those things where it was pretty, I would stand by all that was done on that car. We were very, very happy with it, which is why we're doing it, effectively doing it again. But there are a couple of things that if I designed them again, I'd have changed slightly. Just the way the front mounts are connected on the subframe. Because the subframe was revised to add a bit more compliance to get rid of some noise and vibration that was coming from it, that was a revision done within the constraints of the original frame. Whereas now I'm starting from scratch with those different bushes, I will alter the subframe slightly to accommodate them from the beginning. So there's a couple of changes to do there. So I'll be on with the CAD work around that to do the fixtures and draw up all the parts that I need to do the rear frame. So that's kind of my next move after we've got the basic sort of metalwork done and made sure doors fit and things like that. So that's more or less the way forward. As I say, obviously there's a lot of fettling still to do in terms of fitting doors and things, but they're things Tom can be carrying on with while I'm getting on with working out the way forward on the rear end. But as you can see, it's taking shape as a Ford Escort now, and looking pretty good. It'll look better once some more panels are on it. I noticed a few questions about the bonnet and boot. We have the original ones for the moment, which we're going to use for setting the wing alignments and double checking everything. But we don't have the solution on those at the moment. A couple of people have commented about the delay in getting those from Magnum. Yes, we're currently juggling whether to do those as composite panels, carbon fibre panels, or whether to do them as steel panels from Magnum. And it will depend a little bit on lead time and availability of the steel panels. So decisions yet to be made on that. Certainly for this stage of build, it'll be factory original panels, which were original on this car, but are slightly rusty. Not severely rusty, but too rusty to use. The problem with bonnets and boots for Escorts is for any sort of build where longevity is a key, there basically can't be any rust because it's impossible to get that rust out. If there is any rust at all in a bonnet or a boot for an Escort, it's from our point of view, it's scrap. The slightest piece of rust, and it is of no use to us whatsoever because we can't blast inside the bonnet fray, inside the front edges and inside the seams, and we can't dip them. If you dip them, they will rot out. We've done it before, and it's bitten us before. If you acid dip those, they're scrap. They don't forget it. They will be of no use whatsoever. The rust simply just creeps out afterwards, and with it somewhere, some indeterminate age point from sort of a month after the process to 3 years after the process, the rust will all appear and there'll be no use at all. So basically, if there's any rust in them, they're no use to us. So we need either new steel panels or new composite panels. So that's where we're undecided, but they're the two potential routes forward on that. So that's where we are on that. We're going to leave Churchill this week, mainly because Stu's on holiday. A rare occurrence. Stu's gone on holiday, and I imagine he'll be listening to some peaceful and tranquil air sawing and maybe hammers, maybe planishing hammers as a sort of an audio book for his holiday piece. So yeah, so Stu's away at the moment, so we'll leave church at the moment, and we'll have a little wander through into the body shop area where we have a new old recruit. We
Bonjour.
we have Mark, one of our longest-standing members of staff, is back with us following a sabbatical to France. He's now returned to us, and he's back on the team, which is really good. It's really nice to have him back, and he's in on the bodywork crew at the moment, principally being the bodywork area, but various other tasks as well. There's a couple of other areas he's going to be helping out with as well, but at the moment he's just helping to push through with the Land Cruiser panels, which has been a pretty effective push through. The Gaz has just finished priming the tub and front doors and bonnet. Tub, front doors and bonnet. And all the rest of the panels are looking pretty close. Looking around me, the rest of them are pretty close, mostly in polyester and in the latter stages of prep of polyester by the looks of it. So we're going to be pretty close to most of it in primer. I would say by the end of next week, we're going to be all in primer. Yeah, so things are now racing ahead pretty quickly with many hands making light work as they do. So yeah, it's great to have Mark back, and yeah, keep watching lots of Land Cruiser standing, but it's going to be racing towards paint very rapidly now. Yeah, it's really good to see cracking on. So I think that probably rounds up about where we're at this week. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this little walk round, and see you again in a week's time.